Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. The Almeida farm was a remote place, surrounded by vast cornfields and dense forests. The winds whispered through the leaves, creating a natural symphony that filled the silence. The main house, a rustic wooden structure, stood at the heart of the property. With its weathered plank walls and a porch that creaked under the weight of anyone who ventured up, it exuded an old charm but also an air of mystery. The property had been in the Almeida family for generations. João, the current owner, was a robust and determined man, always ready to face the challenges of country life. By his side, his wife Maria, a woman with a generous heart and skillful hands, cared for the house and children with dedication. Pedro, the teenage son, was in the phase of discovering the world, curious and brave, often venturing around the farm in search of something new. Clara, the youngest, was a lively and dreamy girl, always accompanied by her dog Biscoito. Life on the farm was simple but rewarding. João spent his days tending to the animals and fields, while Maria dedicated herself to the garden and household chores. Pedro and Clara helped as much as they could, making farm life a collective effort. At night, they gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter, feeling safe and protected in that family refuge. But as summer progressed and the nights grew longer, something strange began to happen. The cornfield, always so vibrant and full of life, seemed different. The birds that used to fly around it mysteriously disappeared, and an unsettling silence took over the place. During her morning walks, Maria began to notice that the scarecrow in the middle of the field was different. It was just a subtle impression, but it seemed to change position, as if it had a life of its own. These small details, however, were not enough to alarm the family. They were used to simple life and nature's whims. Little did they know that these signs were just the beginning of something much more sinister to come. The scarecrow had always been there, in the middle of the cornfield, a solitary and inert figure. With its tattered clothes, old straw hat, and button eyes, it served its purpose of scaring away the birds that tried to plunder the crops. João was proud of his scarecrow, which he had built himself years ago, believing it protected his harvest. But lately, Maria had noticed something strange. During her morning walks, she felt as if the scarecrow was watching. It was a disturbing feeling, but she brushed it off, attributing it to her imagination. However, the changes were hard to ignore. The scarecrow seemed to be changing position, as if someone moved it during the night. One afternoon, while Pedro and Clara were playing near the cornfield, they noticed something different too. Clara, with her keen and curious eyes, pointed to the scarecrow and said, Pedro, wasn't it looking that way yesterday?" Pedro laughed, thinking his sister was making things up. But as the days went by, he began to realize Clara was right. The scarecrow seemed to be moving. The farm animals started to act strangely. The dogs, who used to run freely through the fields, now avoided the cornfield, growling and barking at the scarecrow as if it were a real threat. The chickens became agitated, clucking frantically whenever they passed by the field. João, though skeptical, began to worry about the animals' behavior. One night, as the wind howled and the full moon illuminated the landscape, Maria woke up with an uneasy feeling. She got up and went to the window, looking at the cornfield. There, in the dim light, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The scarecrow, with its dark silhouette, seemed to be moving its arms slowly, as if trying to free itself from its bindings. Frightened, she called Joao, who came running, but when he looked out the window, everything seemed normal. You must have imagined it, Maria, Joao said, trying to calm her. But the look on his wife's face worried him. She had never been the type to scare easily. He decided he would check the scarecrow in the morning to make sure everything was fine. The next day, as Joao walked to the cornfield, he felt a chill down his spine. The scarecrow was there, exactly as he had left it, but something seemed wrong. The buttons that made its eyes looked deeper, almost alive. He tried to push away the disturbing thoughts and adjusted the scarecrow, making sure it was securely fastened. But the feeling that something was wrong persisted. Maria, Pedro, and Clara couldn't get the scarecrow out of their minds either. Every movement, every shadow seemed to indicate that it was more than just hanging in the middle of the field. And so, unknowingly, the Almeida family was about to face a threat beyond anything they could imagine. That night, the storm formed quickly, bringing with it lightning and thunder that echoed across the Almeida farm. The rain fell heavily, beating against the windows and roofs, creating a frightening symphony. The family gathered in the living room, trying to distract themselves with a card game, but the tension in the air was palpable. The scarecrow's strange behavior was on everyone's mind. Suddenly, a loud noise came from outside. The dog started barking frantically, and Pedro, his heart racing, looked at his father. "I'll see what it is," Joao said, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. Pedro, with his natural curiosity, insisted on accompanying his father. The two ventured into the stormy darkness, the raindrops drenching their clothes immediately. Joao's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path to the cornfield. The dog's barking guided them, but when they got close, the dogs retreated, growling and baring their teeth at the scarecrow. Pedro, wide-eyed, pointed to the figure in the middle of the field. "Dad, look!" he shouted. The scarecrow was moving, its arms swinging as if being manipulated by an invisible force. Suddenly, it took a step forward. "João!" He blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, the scarecrow was really walking toward them. One of the dogs, in an act of bravery, ran to attack the scarecrow, but the creature, with a quick and surprisingly strong movement, threw the dog aside. Pedro screamed, running to help the injured animal, while Joao, in shock, fell back. Inside the house, Maria and Clara heard the screams and desperate barks. Maria grabbed Clara, trying to keep her calm, but her own heart was racing uncontrollably. "Stay here," as she ordered, but Clara, determined to help, followed her. When they reached the cornfield, Maria saw Joao and Pedro trying to recover. What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Joao pointed at the scarecrow, which was now standing still again, but in a clearly different position. It's alive," Joao said, almost unable to believe his own words. Maria felt a shiver run down her spine. This couldn't be happening, but the evidence was right in front of their eyes. That night was long and restless. The family gathered in the living room, all on edge. The injured dog lay beside Pedro, who was petting its head, trying to comfort it. Clara, with fear in her eyes, clung to her mother. "We have to find out what's going on," as Joao said, determined. "Tomorrow, we will investigate thoroughly. We can't let this thing terrorize us." And so, the Almeida family kept vigil through the night, waiting for dawn to bring some answers. But deep down, they all knew that something terrible had been awakened on that isolated farm, and the real fight for survival was only just beginning. Dawn brought a gray and heavy sky, as if nature itself sensed the evil lurking around the Almeida farm. João, Maria, Pedro, and Clara, exhausted from the sleepless night, gathered in the kitchen to discuss what to do next. João was determined to uncover the origin of the cursed scarecrow and put an end to the torment it was bringing to his family. Pedro, ever curious and brave, suggested an investigation. Let's start with the old farm records, he proposed. And maybe we'll find a clue about the scarecrow. Maria, though frightened, agreed. We need to know what we're dealing with, as she said, holding Clara's hand to give her courage. The family divided into tasks. João and Pedro went to the barn, where an old chest stored documents and objects from the farm's history. Maria and Clara, on the other hand, went to the basement, where old photo albums and books belonging to the Almeida ancestors were kept. While searching the barn, João found an old, dust-covered journal. Look at this, Pedro, he said, carefully opening the book. The yellowed pages were filled with notes from a man named Joaquim, who had worked on the farm many decades ago. Here, he talks about a worker who died mysteriously, as João said, reading aloud. The journal recounted that years ago, a man named Manuel had been hired to work on the farm. He was a stranger in the town, but soon became a part of life on the farm. One day, Manuel disappeared, and shortly after, a scarecrow appeared in the cornfield, made with the clothes he used to wear. Joaquim suspected that Manuel had been murdered and that his spirit had possessed the scarecrow, but he could never prove it. Meanwhile, in the basement, Maria and Clara discovered an old photo of Manuel, with a stern face and piercing eyes that seemed to follow anyone who looked at the image. Clara shivered, feeling a chill. Mom, he looks scary, as she whispered. Maria agreed, but knew they had to continue the search. Back in the kitchen, the family gathered all the information they had found. It looks like Manuel's spirit is trapped in the scarecrow, as João said, with a grim expression. We need to figure out how to free him and end this curse. Pedro, who had been reading Joaquim's journal carefully, found a possible solution. Here it says that Joaquim believed the only way to free the spirit was to dig up Manuel's remains and perform a purification ritual, he explained. But he never had the courage to do it. Maria, though scared, knew they had no choice. We have to try, as she said, determined. We can't keep living with this terror. And so, with new hope, the Almeida family prepared to face the unknown. Armed with the information they had uncovered, they knew that the following night would be crucial. The fight to free Manuel's spirit and end the scarecrow had begun. Unterstrich 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 unter. Twilight brought an unsettling silence to the Almeida farm. The air was thick with tension as the family prepared to face the scarecrow. João, with a resolute expression, gathered everyone in the living room. We'll try burning the scarecrow first, he said. If that doesn't work, we'll dig up Manuel's remains and perform the purification ritual. Equipped with makeshift torches and gasoline, João and Pedro headed to the cornfield. The scarecrow was there, standing as always, but now it emanated a sinister presence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. João poured gasoline over the scarecrow, while Pedro held a torch, ready to light it. And now, as João said, and Pedro threw the torch, setting the scarecrow ablaze instantly. The flames danced, lighting up the dark field, but something terrible happened. The scarecrow moved, letting out a horrifying scream that echoed through the night. Fam! With a sudden movement, it lunged at Joao and Pedro, who barely had time to retreat. The flames didn't seem to affect the creature. Instead, the fire appeared to give it more life, making its movements even faster and more violent. Pedro fell backward, terrified, while Joao tried to protect his son. The scarecrow, now a flaming and demonic figure, advanced on them. Back at the house, Maria and Clara heard the screams and ran to help. Maria, with desperate courage, grabbed a bucket of water and ran into the cornfield. Get away from them! As she shouted to Joao and Pedro, throwing the water on the scarecrow. The flames subsided, but the scarecrow still stood, its button eyes glowing with inhuman fury. This isn't working, Pedro said, panting. We need to perform the ritual. Joao nodded, helping his son to his feet. Let's dig up Manol's remains, he said. Maria, take Clara inside and keep watch. As Maria and Clara returned to the house, Joao and Pedro grabbed shovels and lanterns and went to the spot where Manol had been buried. The night was cold, and every sound seemed amplified, the fear weighing on them. They started digging, the damp and heavy earth making the task difficult, but their determination to protect their family gave them strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they found Manol's remains. Pedro held Joaquim's diary, reading the instructions for the ritual. We need to scatter salt around the bones and burn sage, he said, his voice trembling but firm. Joao did as his son instructed, creating a protective circle. Pedro began reciting the words of the ritual, his voice echoing in the night. As he spoke, the scarecrow appeared at the edge of the field, watching with malevolent eyes. The family felt the pressure of time, knowing they had to complete the ritual before the creature attacked again. The final words of the ritual were spoken, and a strong wind swept across the farm, extinguishing the lanterns and bringing an absolute silence. The scarecrow let out one last anguished cry before collapsing into a pile of burnt straw and rags. Joao and Pedro, exhausted, fell to their knees, embracing each other in relief. We did it, as Joao said, his voice full of emotion. The threat was gone, but the emotional toll of the experience would stay with them forever. The darkness of the night was giving way to a new day on the Almeida farm. The air was still heavy with the events of the previous night, but there was a sense of relief. The scarecrow, that terrifying figure that had tormented the family, was now nothing more than a pile of straw and rags in the middle of the field. Joao, Maria, Pedro, and Clara gathered around the kitchen, still feeling the effects of the past night. They were all exhausted, but they were alive. Joao looked at his family, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. It's over, he said, his voice filled with relief and exhaustion. We made it. Pedro, still holding Joaquim's diary, looked at the remains of the scarecrow outside. It won't bother us anymore, he said, with a mix of pride and fatigue. Clara approached her brother, hugging him tightly. You were very brave, she said, smiling. Maria, with tears in her eyes, thanked everyone. We faced this together, as she said. And now we can move on. They knew the farm would never be the same, but the feeling of victory filled them with a new hope. But the Almeida family knew they couldn't continue living in a place marked by so much pain and fear. Joao made the difficult decision to sell the farm and start anew elsewhere. We need a fresh start, he said, and everyone agreed. As they packed their things, Pedro found an old photo of Manol among the documents. He looked at it for a moment, reflecting on the tormented spirit that had finally found peace. "I hope you're in a better place now," he murmured, carefully putting the photo away. The day of departure arrived, and the family gathered one last time in front of the farm. The sun shone, bringing a sense of renewal. João looked at the house that had been their home for so long, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. "Let's remember the good times we had here," he said, and everyone nodded. As they walked away, Pedro looked back one last time. The cornfield was calm. The scarecrow had disappeared forever. He knew that the experience had changed them, but it had also made them stronger. And so, the Almeida family set out for a new life, carrying with them the memories of the past but also the hope for a better future. The farm was left behind, a silent testament to a battle fought and won, where Manol's spirit finally rested in peace.